This podcast was made possible by the kind support of Alvine Capital Management, a London-based specialist investment advisor and placement boutique. Our next guest is as comfortable writing poetry as he is discussing the energy trilemma, as well as hosting his own podcast, A Sustainable Future. Find out why he believes we need to get comfortable with the noise, have patience to let things settle, and focus on breath in the world of sustainability. I'm Aoife David, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Jason Mitchell, who is co-head of responsible investment at Man Group and the host of A Sustainable Future podcast at the Man Institute, a podcast that he has hosted since 2018 and has now passed its 55th episode. He writes and speaks widely on sustainability issues, as well as serving on a number of committees such as Esmee Fairbairn Foundation and World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Welcome, Jason. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Aoife. It's great to be on this. So thank you for the kind invitation.
Well, delighted to have a fellow podcaster, and we can jump right in and exchange notes. Well, let's start then with your background, how you ended up pursuing a role in the investment world.
Yeah, it's a pretty unconventional story. My mom's an English professor, and sort of I went to uni at UC Berkeley, dead set on becoming an English professor. And so, I'd studied classics and English lit, and for some reason did a lot of C++ coding, although I wasn't an engineering major or a minor. But I think my path coming out of university was pretty fixed in my mind. In fact, when I came out, I was sort of dead set on trying to get a Fulbright scholarship to study actually Indian poetry. That didn't work out. And then that or a grad school in an MFA program, a Master of Fine Arts in poetry. And so I ended up getting into those MFA programs at Columbia and Iowa. Those are the two big programs in the US. But I just had, for a whole number of reasons, a number of mentors of mine, Tom Gunn and another poet, sort of fell ill. One passed away. And I just had this pause in my life where I felt like I could do a lot of different things and come back to writing, particularly leveraging the little amount of coding that I had done. And so I went into consulting, doing a bit of coding, and immediately that led to some work in an investment bank. And I ended up moving over to the investment bank in corporate finance. So, imagine an English major moving into effectively technology mergers and acquisitions. It was a huge learning curve for me, but one that I really, really enjoyed. I did that for about a year and then moved over to sell-side research at Credit Suisse. And then from there, after about a year, moved to a hedge fund called Pequot Capital, which was one of the largest tech-oriented funds run by Art Sandberg out of Connecticut. And so, I was sort of young and really focused in fundamental research and had an amazing experience working for a couple of the largest tech hedge funds during that 1998 to 2000, 2003 period, during the big tech blow up. So that was a huge experience for me. After that, I had the opportunity for one of those funds. One of them was called Andor Capital, to move out to London as a research analyst, start covering European telecoms and media. I did that and then moved over to GLG Partners, which is currently now part of Man Group, where I started developing more PM skills. So I think, I look back and it was just a really, really interesting kind of fast-paced period where I got to sort of satiate this sort of intellectual curiosity around research and meeting companies and understanding stories. So that's sort of the weird origins of that.
It's really interesting. You're not the first English major we've had on here, actually. We've had quite a number who've ended up in investing. And interestingly, obviously your investment chops were well developing when you didn't pursue that MFA, as I think I've seen an article about the low return on investment that they can represent, although I'm sure they are highly enjoyable pursuits.
It's a fair comment.
Yeah, exactly. And before we move on, I need to ask you, why Indian poetry? What was it about that captured your imagination initially?
I had a really big mentor, Bharati Mukherjee at Berkeley, a famous author, and I was really interested in the Dalit literature, the forbidden writings in India. So, the plan was to go to the University of Pune or Allahabad and study it. But sadly, it didn't work out. But I had an interest which seemed to intersect with a phenomenal mentor at that time.
So interesting. And clearly your interest in storytelling is very much alive today, and hence the podcasting. But before we move to that, just want to ask you about sustainable investing. So we spoke a lot about your role in investing, and now you're very firmly in the sustainable investing area. When did you first start to move into that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was working at GLG Partners, managing a long short strategy in telecoms and media. So I had a bit of an infrastructure background in the listed market space. When the global financial crisis sort of came around, I wanted to take time off. In truth, there was an opportunity to work with someone, and I ended up leaving GLG Partners, taking some time off. And so that happened sort of mid 2008. And then in early 2009, unfortunately, given the links of non-competes, but that opportunity, not surprisingly, evaporated. It was just a victim of the global financial crisis. And so I think for me, it was a really important, difficult period, at least in my own personal life, because my whole identity had been defined as portfolio manager and in funds. And over the next 1 to 2 years, I really had to develop on my strengths some other interests. And so at that time, I knew some people at the African Development Corporation, which is a German private equity firm that was listed at one point. But I started doing some advisory work for them. That took me to Sub-Saharan Africa. I soon became the COO on one of their water infrastructure companies that basically does potable water all across, again, Sub-Saharan Africa. And from then, it was a fascinating experience, but I was able to then become an advisor for what's now called, it's the UK government's, the Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council. So it's kind of like the CDC, but it doesn't have its own balance sheet. And so I was wearing obviously a lot of hats, but in that role, I was working on helping to coordinate multilateral funding for agriculture and water projects in areas like Joburg in South Africa, in Ghana, in Nigeria. So that was a really important period for me. So back to your point, and I apologize if that's a bit of a tangent, but I think that experience really made me reflect, or kind of forced me to define what sustainability means or meant on my own terms. And from the work doing things that, kind of peri-urban water infrastructure planning outside of Lagos, it sort of forced me to think through this idea that sustainability, at least in a non-normative, a kind of a materialist view, is it's the investment required to address demographic, environmental, and social change. It's the investment required to sustain or improve standards of living. And I think that brought me to a real interest in going back and doing a master's of science at London School of Economics, and ultimately even consider working for a development bank, particularly a place like the IFC within the World Bank. And so my plan was then, having really been exposed and been interested to effectively, but particularly in 2009, when you think about the global financial crisis happening, seeing competing development models at play. I remember being in Cape Town for the World Economic Forum in 2009, and you had this Western development model that was under a lot of attack, and then this Chinese development model, which was obviously very different, that seemed to be flourishing. And I think for me, that was the beginning of maybe intellectualizing a little bit sustainability and wanting to pursue it through a master's degree.
Well, let's just dive in then a little bit to what's at the forefront of your mind now, because a lot of how you described sustainability sounds a lot like impact. And it would be nice to maybe go through some of these words that we're all using today and maybe say where you think they will feature, let's say the next 5 years of, say, your practice area. So you mentioned there that you've done more of an academic analysis of sustainability. What's at the forefront of your mind now in terms of sustainable investments, how you define that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things at the forefront, but I completely agree. I mean, the pros are that it is malleable and open for definition, which I think is really exciting and interesting for anyone new in this space. The academic research is really just developing, or has been developing over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's an area where you can be a part of and really engage within that dialogue. I think the drawback to that is that, like you said, there's almost too much language and certainly too many acronyms around this area. And I think where that is probably most manifested right now in the forefront of sustainability is how we harmonize across this from a regulatory perspective. So what we have seen over the last 10 to 20 years is something that has been very process oriented, but very individualistic and without regulatory oversight. regulation isn't the most exciting thing, but I've just been continually surprised at how controversial regulation and accounting in this space is. So what we're starting to see, clearly with the European Union moving faster than everyone else over the last several years, is the sustainable finance strategy manifested through the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. We're starting to see some movement out of the UK on this. And in fact, last week, we just saw in the US, the SEC really start to come out and mandate, or at least propose mandated climate disclosure regulations. The point of all this is to say that I think we're moving towards a really important baseline, sort of a common understanding for how we talk about, analyze, and express exposures and products and metrics in this space.
We're hearing a lot about the movement towards net zero by institutions, asset managers themselves. Do you think we're getting any closer to a baseline there around what that actually means and how we will get there?
Yeah, we definitely are moving towards that. Again, in context, net zero has only been a thing over the last 3 years. And in fact, many people would not have thought this, but it's in fact actually grown and really gained significant momentum even through the pandemic, which is incredible to think about. So no doubt we are moving towards a baseline, but one of the difficult conversations that needs to be had, and indeed, we are having parts of it, is this idea of the energy trilemma. It's this idea that policymakers are trying to solve for three things in the energy transition. So the first one is, as you said, decarbonization through models or frameworks like net zero. And only 9 to 12 months ago, that seemed like the top priority within this idea of this energy trilemma. But again, policymakers also have to take into account two other factors in that trilemma. The second one is price affordability. And this became, ironically, a problem even as we headed into COP26, where you had extreme volatility in energy markets. And I think there was a pause by many policymakers worrying that in the push towards decarbonization, you can't create so much inflation that you end up creating a new class of energy poor. That's untenable. What's interesting now, only over the last 2 to 3 months, is what Ukraine means to that. Because the third point within that energy trilemma is security of supply, energy security. And again, 9 to 12 months ago, Russia was a dependable supplier of gas. And now through sanctions, through self-sanctioning, et cetera, they're being pushed out of that. And so I think it's been interesting to sort of see this energy trilemma click through and reprioritize all of these, even over the last 12 months. So there's so much legislation now around net zero efforts, around decarbonizing the economy over the next 10, 20, or 30 years that we're certainly on path. We will hold that course. However, the question is, to what degree is that path bumpy or not through issues like price affordability and energy security issues?
Exactly. And also to what degree the path is a straight line trajectory or full of moguls, essentially downhill with moguls, because clearly it is geopolitical setbacks like we've encountered that may temporarily throw us off course. The other part of that equation, besides the push to decarbonize generally equity portfolios, which is the mainstay of most institutional allocators, is the piece where recognizing that it will never be decarbonized to zero. So how do we get to zero? The piece around the term offset is not a popular one, but whether it's carbon capture technologies or forestation plans or creating some kind of healthy water investment opportunities or around climate tech. What do you see as the other interesting, maybe in the other side of that kind of balance sheet?
Yeah, I want to spend a little bit of time on offsets, if you don't mind. It's incredibly important. And as you say, somewhat controversial. Clearly there is a large spectrum of quality when it comes to offsets. On one hand, you've got carbon avoidance, but you're starting to develop, and they are still very tight markets, more credible carbon removal offsets. My own view is that we are starting to see some push out or reluctance, or I would say an over-reliance on technologies, carbon capture, for instance, maybe blue or green hydrogen, some other areas, even ammonia, that become commercially available and sort of large scale in the 2030 plus period. And so what I do wonder is if we have to be a bit more pragmatic about the use of offsets. No one wants to see bad behavior or low quality offsets out there. What we need are better offset markets or higher quality offset markets to at least manage this from a halfway perspective. But to your question, the other area in my mind is stewardship, is engagement. It's an area that is relatively new for Man Group. And I mean that in two ways. I mean, Man Group has two basic parts to it. On the quant side, we systematically vote, but we don't necessarily engage. We haven't historically engaged because quant funds don't necessarily engage. On the alternative side, we engage a lot, but we don't necessarily vote because many times we express ourselves through synthetics, derivatives, where you end up forfeiting your right to vote. And I think where we've gotten around that and kind of solved for these issues over the last couple of years, and it's really manifested over the past, I would say, 2 years in a way that I'm very, very happy for. As an aside, I chair our stewardship committee. So this is something that I spend a lot of time on, is effectively building out a really strong stewardship team and starting to engage, even to the point of pushing shareholder resolutions or helping to co-file shareholder resolutions. It's an important point. I'd say last year was the first time that we co-filed a climate shareholder resolution or even a shareholder resolution against HSBC. It was the first time in our 238-year history. And it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of discussion, even up to the board level, about the implications for that, even from a cultural perspective. I can say this year we've already filed another one, and we're in the process of working on 2 more in Asia. So I think what's come out of that in a net zero context is we are really starting to accelerate or effectively change language within climate transition plans, making them more front-end loaded, making them more granular, turning ambitions into harder commitments.
I mentioned before that we both share a passion for podcasting, and you have the wonderful A Sustainable Future podcast, which is now well entrenched as required listening among responsible investing and sustainable practitioners. I'd love to know both the origins of that and what you've learned over the 4 years that you posted it.
The origin of it came outside of Man Group or even finance. I was really interested in doing something like this, but for a good part of 2016, I was taking a little bit of time out from work and effectively following the European migration from Calais in France to Turkey to Lesbos, and ultimately working with a German NGO off the coast of Libya. And I think out of that experience, I had heard so many powerful stories. In fact, I actually ended up writing some essays, one of which appeared in the London Review of Books, and in a number of poems that were published. But I wanted to capture some medium for the voices I was hearing. So that was the origin. I had ended up getting some financial support from it, from an EU agency. Unfortunately, Brexit ended up scuttling that. And so I was sort of looking for another avenue. And I think in sustainability, to go back to my intellectual curiosity and all this, I just found that most podcasts, and yeah, you probably agree with me, but most podcasts, at least back then, it's certainly changed now, but tended to be largely marketing platforms for a firm's portfolio managers or strategists. And I just couldn't kind of believe that there wasn't one that was capturing. By the way, you're doing a great job of just kind of capturing all the amazing, diverse voices out there. And so effectively, that's what I had wanted to do. I had just ended up realizing that it was an incredible opportunity to reach out to some people that I, incredibly respected and might not have known. It gave me a chance to really read up and kind of learn something in a sprint form and produce something that can be shared.
And I know people ask me this question all the time, whether I have any favorites or whether there was one that was particularly memorable. But maybe, can you think of any that were particularly memorable and maybe that you learned something from?
There are a few that really resonate with me. I'd say Mary Robinson, the one with her. And I think she's been phenomenal. She's the former president of Ireland, but phenomenal with the UN SDGs and work with the elders. But one of her big themes is sort of dignity. And that was an area that, following the work that I'd done on the migrant crisis, that people in need, people in flight, people, in some cases, the most vulnerable they've ever been. It struck me that it was sort of a really powerful, simple thing that meant a lot to her. There was another with the president of a Spanish bank that I did in Barcelona that just surprised me. I came in asking about how Spain and the bank were sort of preparing for the upcoming EU ESG regulation and legislation. And he really pushed back and pointed and was very focused on climate change in a way that caught me off guard. I thought that there were so many other boring regulatory constraints and obligations that he would have talked to get the organization. And I just asked him that. And he looked at me in the most personal way. And he said, Barcelona is 5-10 meters above sea level. We will be the first victims of climate change. And it was one of those moments where you feel that something personal is at stake in what that person is saying. It's honest, it's vulnerable, it's almost reactive. That one meant a lot, that specific comment. And then there's another one that always stands out to me. Her name is Alice Hill. She was the former director in the National Security Council in the Obama administration, a former federal judge. She's currently the climate fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, but she has just been nominated by President Biden as deputy director for FEMA around resilience. So she's just a superstar. And I think I found, again, at this point, she was working at the Council on Foreign Relations, but it was just an honest, almost eviscerating appraisal of the normative, of the institutional and regulatory damage that the Trump administration was doing when I first interviewed her in mid to late 2018. As you well know, it's that kind of honesty that makes for great podcasts.
Absolutely. And I think the power of listening that one develops on the other side of the mic, like I'm on now, is really great. And I would just refer the listeners to the glittering array of guests, because there really are some fantastic conversations. And I'm going to go back to some of these and re-listen now that you've highlighted some of these, because there is a lot out there. But as you said, voices really matter, and gathering them is so key. So just want to move back to some personal reflections now. So you've had a career that has had many twists and turns. Were there any setbacks and challenges, or even mistakes, investment mistakes, that you have experienced that you can share?
Yeah, I wouldn't say investment mistakes. I'm sure there were many, but none that stick out. I think for me, the big setback was launching a sustainability strategy in 2010, feeling like I was fairly early in the process. I mean, there were some other great firms, Generation, Impacts, that were doing that as well. I think that we struggled, not for performance, but I think at the time we just weren't the firm that was green and sustainable. I think that it was sort of a small, neglected product, particularly relative to the kind of high margin alternative products out there. And so I think for me, a big personal step back and professional was when we ended up closing that fund at the end of 2015. And, again, I sort of marvel because 1 to 2 years later, the industry just jackknifed up, and there's been an incredible interest in these kinds of products. So for me, that was a real big down point in my career. The way that I ended up trying to work through it was I joined as a co-PM and on a number of other funds, a number of other long-only strategies. But I think if I couldn't express myself in a fund format, in a kind of a dedicated sustainability fund format, I was looking for ways, even in my personal life, to kind of express that, which is why literally at the time that the fund closed, I ended up just deciding to, again, run towards the migrant crisis in Dunkirk and Calais, which sort of led on to working in Turkey, which led on to working in Lesbos, and ultimately off the coast of Libya, and trying to develop that. And I think for me, it was interesting because, I'd spent my entire life, in the sustainability realm, thinking through this heavy climate lens. And then this sort of forced me through the human social element of refugees or forced migrants.
It certainly seems like some of those lessons you learned was only because you were too early, perhaps, or too prescient. I often think when you spend time as you have in investment roles and hedge fund roles, as well as now developing new strategies, you certainly become quite adept at spotting some of what the investment world loves to call frauds, fads, failures, fantasies, whatnot. As you've looked over the landscape of sustainable investing over the years, because clearly you were early, are there any that have sort of stood out to you as being suspect in terms of just perhaps over-promising, under-delivering, mislabeling, the well-known greenwashing phenomenon?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm always sort of interested. Look, I know that there's bad behavior out there, and clearly greenwashing. I'd written an article in the FT several years ago asking this question: is greenwashing a necessary evil? And the fact is, even now, it's incredibly hard to define greenwashing on a standalone basis. And it's even harder coming to a common definition among people. The most amount of effort in this area has been in Europe in terms of creating protections against greenwashing. And what we've seen is this sort of piecemeal approach at the EU level and then among different national regulators, some of which have decided to gold plate their funds. And so I think what you're sort of left with is a misunderstanding of what it is. And I would say, and also a misunderstanding of the industry for what we're trying to solve for, or at least what policymakers are solving for, i.e., the current legislation is around disclosure frameworks. It's not a label. That's not the point of it. In fact, I can tell you tomorrow, I'm actually doing a podcast with the European Commission, Alan Deckers, who heads the asset management within DG FISMA. And so he will talk about all this architecture. And I think that's his big bugbear, is this sort of industry misinterpreting it. So look, I clearly recognize that there is bad behavior out there. What I try and weigh that against or balance that against is this need to let things settle from a regulatory perspective. I wonder if we need to inure ourselves, be comfortable with a period of noise and uncomfortability as regulation starts to settle a bit more and these definitions become a bit more commonplace. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's really a stimulating idea. So I think thanks for sharing that. I speak, a lot of these podcasts are about diversity, as you mentioned, and we speak a lot about being comfortable, being uncomfortable, because some of those diversity discussions around bias or inclusion can be uncomfortable. I love that concept you've just introduced of being comfortable around noise and lack of precision, perhaps, and of lack of clear-cut policies and initiatives, because I think we often have a desire to reduce the noise and really simplify when perhaps we have to just, as you said, let things settle. Really interesting idea. Thanks.
Yeah. And what I would also add is, again, this is where the Europeans, I think, have really done a phenomenal job. The way they're working towards there is not just regulatory, but a legislative form, which is a very important distinction. They are playing the long game as they're sort of tightening pieces of legislation, protections against greenwashing. They might seem principle-based or principle-oriented at first, but the point is that they become more and more rigorous and harmonized over time through fitness tests or new small pieces of legislation, or effectively fitting in with other pieces of legislation, i.e. the taxonomy, to create this really interesting mosaic. This is, I would say, very, very important because it means that you're not running into the issue that often I'd say the US runs into, where the SEC can regulate, but there's a problem in terms of legislation, given all the political divisiveness currently within Congress. So what you end up doing is you're sort of bounced around through electoral cycles in the US. You've got 4 years of regulatory review, but that might change. That's not the case at all in other areas like Europe.
Just move now to any key people throughout your career that have really motivated you. I think we spoke a little bit about some of your some of those thought leaders that really inspired you. Was there anybody else throughout your career that really made a difference or influenced you along the way?
I would say that people in finance that I was lucky enough to work with, Art Sandberg from Pequot Capital, a legend in the space, Dan Betton, certainly on the tech side, in the early 2000s. Chris James, I had the opportunity to work with him over at Amdor Capital and Pequot Capital. He obviously now runs Engine Number One. So it's phenomenal and really interesting to kind of see that migration towards, a stewardship forward activist approach. I'd also say Pierre Lagrange. If there was anyone that I've learned a lot from, both professionally and personally, I would say Pierre Lagrange, who was obviously the L in GLG partners.
You've mentioned some legends there.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the commonality among all of them is just their focus, their persistence is unequaled. I'd also say that they, as investors, were just always intellectually honest and curious, at least from my perspective.
And in terms of any words of wisdom or advice that any of those mentors shared with you, or any creed or motto that you live by?
There are a few that I kind of live by. I would not necessarily attribute them to them. So no doesn't mean never. I think that's really important. I think my younger self tended to get incredibly frustrated around opportunities. And I think there's a lot to say for patience and the fact that the wheel of fortune is always turning, and the fact that you can always make things happen for yourself around barriers. The one I would attribute to my mom, and I live and die by this, is just, you've always got to have balls in the air. You've always got to have plates spinning. just this idea that you're always trying to publish something at the same time that you're always working on presentation, at the same time that you're trying to go for a trustee or a position within an initiative. I think that's what's driven me, which is probably why I've been lucky to have had a lot of opportunities and have a lot of opportunities working with some great people across a lot of different organizations.
And the interesting thing is, I think when you've had a career in finance with the natural volatility that comes with that, I think that's where you learn to have the balls in the air, irons in the fire, pick your kind of idiom.
Absolutely.
Exactly, because you know how quickly one option can shut down. So I think, unfortunately, that's, I think, just one of life lessons. You're not born with it, but I think it is important to learn. My last question is, there any advice you might have for your younger self?
I would say slow down and focus a bit more on breadth. When I look at my life and sort of the periods where I learned the most outside of university, I'd have to say it was that period when I left GLG, got a master's, and really started working in different ways for the UK government or some other areas. And that was just a huge intellectual learning exercise for me, as was then, as I said, when my strategy was sort of closed down at the end of 2015, then sort of running towards the fire effectively during this sort of crisis and trying to learn as much as I can and help in the way that I could or write about it. And so I think those periods in my life have been the most illuminating about me, about life. They've been the times where I've learned the most.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. You were the first guest who's used the word trilemma so effortlessly. And I think that in itself really indicates the breadth that you bring to every issue. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. I love the fact that you're such a great thinker. You are so intellectually curious and that you are continuing to tell your stories with such vigor. And I look forward to seeing the continued success of A Sustainable Future podcast, as well as the rest of your writing. So thank you so much for coming here and for generously sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really, really enjoyed this. And you do a phenomenal job on your own podcast. I'm envious about how productive you are.
Well, I will say, I know from our another fellow podcaster, David Hickey, that it's you that has all the gear. So I'm a very stripped down in terms of gear, but I do share your passion. So thanks again. I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you'll find a library of role models, resources, and other solutions to enhance your career. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.